Wren Calloway sat in her car in the parking lot of the Crestfall Community Center and counted the bills in her hand for the third time, as if the number might change if she was careful enough. It did not change. $500. That was everything she had left. Everything that remained after 18 years of marriage, 9 months of divorce proceedings, and a settlement that gave her 2 children and almost nothing else. In 4 days, her landlord would begin the process of reclaiming her apartment. She had no job, no savings, no plan that extended past Friday. What you are about to hear is a story of what happened when this woman with $500 and 2 children depending on her walked into a government auction and bought the one thing nobody else in that room wanted: a condemned military bunker buried in the hills outside a small Wyoming town. Everyone laughed. The local paper made a joke of it. Her ex-husband sent a text she never answered. But what Wren Calloway found when she finally pried open that rusted steel door, a door that had not moved in over 70 years, would silence every one of them. Because sealed inside that bunker was a secret that someone had spent 3 decades protecting, a truth worth more than anyone in Crestfall could have imagined, and it had been waiting underground for the exact kind of person desperate enough to find it. This is the story of how one woman's last $500 became the most powerful decision she ever made. I need to write part one of the story, approximately 8,000 words. Let me first check the relevant skill file, since this will be a long piece of content that should be saved as a file. Actually, the user explicitly said, write in plain text, no docx, no txt. So they want the content in line in the conversation. Let me write part one directly. Wren Calloway sat in her car in the parking lot of the Crestfall Community Center and counted the bills in her hand for the third time, as if the number might change if she was patient enough. It did not change. $500. 5 wrinkled, soft-edged bills folded together like a letter no one wanted to send. That was everything. That was what remained of 18 years of showing up, of building something with her hands and her hours and her quiet, steady presence, only to watch it get signed away in a courthouse on a Tuesday afternoon while the judge checked his watch and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass. She sat with the money in her palm and the engine off and the Wyoming wind coming down hard off the Bighorn foothills, rocking the Subaru in small irregular pulses that made the rearview mirror tremble. November in Crestfall had a particular quality to it. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just flat and gray and honest, in the way that only empty landscapes can be honest. The sky offered nothing. The parking lot offered nothing. The community board on the lamppost at the edge of the lot offered a flyer for a church bake sale and a notice about a lost dog, and half hidden beneath both of them something else. But she had not seen that yet. For now she sat, and for the first time in 3 months, with no children in the car, and no one watching, and no next task demanding her attention, Wren Calloway allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened to her life. It settled over her the way weather settles over open country, slowly and then all at once and with nowhere to hide from it. She was 44 years old. She had 2 children who depended on her completely. She had 4 days left on her apartment lease. She had no employment, no savings, no family within 200 miles, and no version of the future she could see clearly enough to walk toward. The $500 in her hand was not a safety net. It was the last inch of rope. She had not cried in front of her children in 3 months. Not when the court finalized the divorce. Not when the movers came and took the furniture that was technically Garrett's because his name was on every receipt, every invoice, every proof of purchase for every object in a home she had maintained for nearly 2 decades. Not when Margot, her 17-year-old daughter, quietly packed her bedroom into 2 garbage bags without being asked. Because Margot had learned to read the rooms of crisis long before any 17-year-old should have had to. Not when Lachlan, her 14-year-old son, told her one evening while they were sharing a gas station dinner in the parking lot of the Crestfall Quick Stop that he did not really need new cleats this season, that his old ones were fine. He had said it casually, the way boys that age learn to say things they do not mean when they are trying to protect someone they love from the cost of the truth. Ren had looked at his feet under the dashboard light and seen what he was not saying. The cleats were 2 sizes too small. She had watched him wince every time he kicked a ball for the past 6 weeks, and she had said nothing, because saying something would have meant admitting she could not fix it. And admitting she could not fix it would have meant the last wall between her children and the full reality of their situation had come down. So she had not cried in front of them. She had held it in the way you hold a breath underwater, not because you are strong, but because letting go means drowning, and drowning is not an option when other people are depending on you to swim. But sitting alone in that parking lot on a gray November morning with the wind pulling at the edges of everything, and that $500 folded in her hand like a last will and testament, Ren let the breath go. She leaned forward until her forehead touched the steering wheel, and she cried in the way that people cry when they have been holding it for so long that the sound that comes out does not sound like crying at all. It sounds like something structural giving way. She stayed like that for a long time, long enough that the parking lot changed around her. A woman loaded groceries into her car. 2 men stood outside the hardware store talking about nothing urgent. A school bus moved slowly down Center Street with its amber lights flashing. Everything in Crestfall looked exactly the same as it always had, and nothing in the world seemed to know that Ren Calloway was sitting 30 feet away, holding the last $500 between her children and the street. Before we go further into Ren's story, take a moment and subscribe to this channel, because what she discovers inside that bunker is something no one saw coming. And if this story resonates with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Ren Calloway had not always been a woman sitting alone in a parking lot with $500 and nowhere to go. There had been a version of her, a younger and steadier version, who had walked through the world with direction and a quiet kind of confidence that people noticed without always being able to name it. She had been the kind of person who arrived early, stayed late, and never confused motion with progress. She knew the difference. She had been taught the difference. She had grown up in Laramie, the second of 3 daughters born to a mechanic named Boyd Calloway and a school teacher named Judith, who graded papers at the kitchen table every night after dinner like it was a sacrament. They were not wealthy people. Boyd worked with his hands 6 days a week at a repair shop on 3rd Street that smelled permanently of motor oil and honesty, and Judith taught 4th grade at Laramie Elementary for 27 years without ever once calling in sick, because Judith Calloway believed that showing up was not a virtue, but a baseline, the minimum standard below which a person should never allow themselves to fall. They had raised their 3 daughters accordingly. The Calloway house was not strict in the way that word is sometimes used to describe households governed by fear. It was structured, it was deliberate. Meals happened at the same time every day. Homework was completed before anything else. Saturdays were for chores and Sundays were for church, and the hours in between were accounted for, not because Boyd and Judith did not trust their children, but because they believed that discipline was a form of love, and that a young person who learned to organize her time would eventually learn to organize her life. Ren had absorbed this completely. She was not the loudest of the 3 sisters, not the most outgoing, not the one who drew attention. She was the one who got things done. She was good at school, not in a showy way, not in the way that earns awards or special recognition, but in the way of someone who genuinely wanted to understand things, who asked questions not to impress teachers, but because the answers mattered to her. She studied accounting at the University of Wyoming because accounting was the language of how things actually worked, the underlying math of every business, every household, every life that needed to balance what came in against what went out. She understood that language instinctively, the way some people understand music or weather or the moods of animals. She graduated on time, which sounds simple and was not. She worked 2 jobs throughout college, tutored on weekends, and maintained a grade point average that was not exceptional but was consistent, which in Wren's understanding of the world was better than exceptional. Consistency was what lasted. Consistency was what Boyd and Judith had built their lives on, and it was what Wren intended to build hers on. She landed a position with a mid-sized agricultural firm in Casper before she had even attended her own graduation ceremony. She was 23 years old. She had a salary that felt enormous to a girl from a mechanic's household in Laramie. She had a studio apartment she furnished herself piece by piece, each item chosen with care and intention, because Wren Calloway did not acquire things impulsively. She acquired them the way her mother graded papers, with attention and patience and the understanding that every small thing was part of a larger structure. She had a 5-year plan written out in a green spiral notebook she kept on her nightstand. The plan was specific and practical. Year 1, establish herself at the firm. Year 2, begin studying for the CPA exam. Year 3, pass it. Year 4, begin saving for a down payment on a small house. Nothing extravagant, something solid, something hers. Year 5, reassess and plan the next 5. Reassess and, by every reasonable measure, Wren Calloway at 23 was exactly where she had intended to be. She was organized. She was employed. She was building something, and she was building it the way her parents had taught her, one careful brick at a time. She met Garrett Holden at a colleague's barbecue the summer she turned 25. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and easy with conversation in the particular way that certain men are easy with conversation, not because they listen well, but because they speak with such confidence that listening becomes unnecessary. Garrett filled a room not by being loud, but by being certain. Certain of his opinions, certain of his plans, certain that everything was going to work out because things generally had for him, and he had no reason to believe the pattern would change. He ran a small landscaping crew at the time, 4 men and 2 trucks, but he talked about it the way a general talks about an army. This was the beginning of something much larger. He had plans, he had vision, he had the kind of ambition that does not sit quietly in a room, but instead stands at the center of it and expects everyone else to arrange themselves around it. Wren, who respected ambition the way her father respected a well-running engine, found herself drawn in before she had thought carefully enough about what she was being drawn toward. Garrett was not unkind. He was not dishonest, at least not in any way she could identify at the time. He was simply a man who had learned very early that the world would rearrange itself to accommodate his confidence, and he had no reason to question whether that accommodation came at someone else's expense. They dated for 14 months. They married in a small ceremony in Laramie with both families present. Boyd Calloway shook Garrett's hand firmly and said very little, which Wren understood at the time as approval and would later understand as something closer to reservation. Judith hugged her daughter and whispered something about always keeping her own accounts, which Wren heard and noted, and then in the rush of everything that came next, gradually forgot. Wren was 27 when she became Wren Holden, though she kept Calloway as her legal middle name, a detail that would matter later in ways she could not have imagined at the time. She told herself she would keep working after the wedding. She meant it fully when she said it. The 5-year plan in the green spiral notebook had been updated to include the marriage, and it still had her at the accounting firm through year 3 at minimum. She was not a woman who abandoned her plans. She was a woman who executed them. Margot arrived 11 months later, earlier than planned, with the particular force that first children tend to arrive with, reorganizing everything around them without apology or negotiation. Wren took a leave of absence from the firm. The leave was supposed to be 12 weeks. It extended. Garrett's landscaping business was growing faster than either of them had expected. He had landed a contract with a commercial developer in Crestfall, a small town in the foothills that was beginning to attract resort money and vacation property investors. The work required him to be on site 6 days a week. The logistics of two full-time careers and an infant in a region with limited childcare options made the math come out the same way every time Wren ran it. And Wren ran it many times because she was a woman who trusted numbers, and the numbers were clear. Someone had to be the one who stayed. Wren was the one who stayed. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself this for years, the way people tell themselves things that are easier to defer than to examine. She said it when Lachlan came 3 years after Margot. She said it when the accounting firm filled her position permanently and sent her a polite letter thanking her for her service. She said it when Garrett's business expanded from residential landscaping into full landscape design and commercial contracts, growing into something substantial, something with employees and equipment, and an office with his name on the door. By the time their children were in elementary school, the family had moved to Crestfall, where Garrett had landed a major contract with the resort development on the eastern edge of town. They bought a house in the Millbrook subdivision. It had a proper driveway and new appliances and enough square footage to make Wren's studio apartment in Casper feel like something from another century. Garrett's name was on the mortgage. Garrett's name was on the business. Garrett's name was on the trucks that drove through town with Holden Landscape Design painted on the side in green and gold letters. And Wren had become, without any single decision she could point to, without any moment she could identify as the one where everything shifted, the person who made everything else possible. She ran the household. She managed the scheduling. She handled the school communications, organized the family finances. She was never quite given full access to drove to every practice and every appointment and every school event. She hosted the dinners Garrett needed for his business relationships with the kind of effortless warmth that people complimented without recognizing as labor. She was, by the definitions most commonly applied to such things, an exceptional wife. She was also quietly and gradually disappearing. She did not see it clearly while it was happening. That is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about those years, and it is the thing that Wren would later wish someone had said to her directly early enough to matter. It is difficult to perceive the slow narrowing of a life when you are busy living it, when there are lunches to pack, and permission slips to sign, and a husband whose growing business seems to require more of your invisible support with each passing season. The walls close in so slowly that you mistake them for the natural shape of the room. You forget that the room was once larger. You forget that you once had a green spiral notebook with a 5-year plan that had nothing to do with anyone else's ambition. Wren had not noticed how thoroughly she had been absorbed into Garrett's life until the day his attorney handed her a document that made clear in precise legal language just how little of that life had ever been structured to include her. It had taken Garrett less than 2 weeks to file the papers after he walked out. 18 years of marriage, 18 years of showing up, of being the one who kept the household breathing, the one who remembered the dentist appointments and the teacher conferences and the oil changes and the property tax deadlines. And he had walked into a law office on a Monday and walked out with a plan to dismantle all of it by Friday. His attorney was a man named Gerald Fitch, who had represented half the business owners in Crestfall over the past 2 decades, and who understood the local legal landscape the way a rancher understands his own fence lines. The landscaping business, the trucks, the equipment, the commercial contracts, all of it was structured under a company that Garrett had reorganized 2 years before the divorce was filed. 2 years. While Wren was still packing his lunch and hosting his clients and believing that the silences at dinner were exhaustion rather than strategy, Garrett had been meeting with Fitch and an accountant and restructuring everything so that when the time came, the division of assets would divide almost nothing in her direction. Wren had co-signed documents during those 2 years. Garrett had brought them home, casually slid them across the kitchen counter while she was making dinner or helping Lachlan with homework, and said things like, "Just some paperwork for the business restructuring. The accountant needs your signature. It is routine." And Wren, who had once understood financial documents better than most people in any room she entered, had signed them. She had signed them because she trusted him. She had signed them because trust, after 18 years, was supposed to be the one thing you did not have to audit. Her own attorney, a kind but overwhelmed woman from the county legal aid office named Patricia Sims, had done her best. Patricia had 3 other active cases, a shared office with no paralegal, and a filing system that consisted primarily of stacked manila folders on every horizontal surface. She was intelligent and she was compassionate, and she was completely outmatched by Gerald Fitch, who billed $400 an hour and had a conference room with leather chairs and a view of the mountains. It was not a fair fight. It was never intended to be a fair fight. The settlement was finalized after 9 months of proceedings that wore Wren down to something she barely recognized in the mirror. She received $3,200 and joint custody of Margot and Lachlan. Garrett kept the house in Millbrook. Garrett kept the business. Garrett kept the life they had assembled together, the life she had spent 18 years building the invisible infrastructure for, the life that would not have existed without her labor, but that bore his name on every legal document that mattered. He also kept their shared social circle. Most of their friends chose sides the way people choose teams, based on proximity and convenience rather than principle. Garrett was the one with the business and the house and the dinners. Wren was the one with the apartment in the flats. The math was simple, even for people who did not think of themselves as the kind of people who did that kind of math. Wren used $2,400 of the settlement to rent a 2-bedroom apartment in the older part of Crestfall, the part of town people referred to as the Flats, where the streets had not been repaved since the 90s, and every house seemed to need something: a new roof, a new porch railing, a coat of paint that no one had gotten around to applying. She spent the remaining $800 on groceries, school supplies, a second-hand lamp, and 2 sets of bed sheets. She applied for 18 jobs in the first 6 weeks: receptionist positions, retail openings, a part-time role at the Crestfall Public Library that she wanted badly because the library was quiet and organized and full of the kind of structured purpose that had always made Wren feel like herself. She received 4 responses. 2 were automated rejections. 1 was a request for an interview that was canceled the following day with no explanation. The 4th was a polite note informing her that the position had been filled internally. Her accounting license had lapsed. Reinstatement would require recertification courses, exam fees, and study time she did not have. The career she had stepped away from temporarily had been temporarily gone for 16 years. The green spiral notebook with the 5-year plan was in a box in her parents' garage in Laramie, buried under yearbooks and childhood things, and it might as well have been on the moon. Now the 3-month lease on the apartment was expiring. Her landlord, a retired rancher named Clive, had been patient and not unkind. He was a man in his 70s who had come through his own difficult seasons and recognized one when he saw it. But patience has a shape, and Clive's had reached its edges. A formal letter slid under her door the previous Thursday, typed and signed, letting her know that if she could not pay the next month's rent by the end of the week, he would need to begin the process of reclaiming the unit. He had apologized in the letter. He had meant the apology. That somehow made it worse. $500. That was what remained after buying the children winter coats from the second-hand shop on Birch Street, paying the gas bill, and covering Lachlan's antibiotics when the ear infection came on hard and she could not afford to let it go untreated. $500 for a woman with 2 children and no employment and 4 days left on her apartment. She sat in that parking lot for a long time after the crying stopped. She watched the people of Crestfall move through their ordinary Tuesday. She watched them carry groceries and open doors and check their phones and do all the small mechanical things that people do when their lives are functioning normally, when the ground beneath them is solid and the next month is not a question but an assumption. Everything looked the same as it always had. and Wren Calloway sat 30 feet away from all of it on the other side of a line she had not known existed until she was standing on the wrong side of it. That was when she noticed the flyer. It had been stapled to the community board on the lamppost at the edge of the parking lot, half covered by a notice for a church bake sale and the lost dog poster she had seen earlier. The paper was slightly damp from the morning air, the ink beginning to bleed at the edges. She almost did not see it. She almost drove away. But something made her stop and look. Call it desperation. Call it instinct. Call it the particular attention of someone who has run out of every other option and whose eyes, as a consequence, have begun scanning the world differently, looking for doors and walls that everyone else sees as solid. Crestfall County Government Surplus and Condemned Property Auction. Thursday, 10 a.m., County Administration Building. All property sold as is. No warranties, no exceptions. Wren sat with the flyer in her hands for a long, quiet moment. The wind pulled at the edges of the paper. Somewhere across the parking lot, a car door slammed. A man called out to someone she could not see. The ordinary world continued its ordinary business. Then she folded the flyer, carefully placed it in her coat pocket beside the $500, and started the car. She spent the next 2 days turning it over in her mind, the way you turn over a problem that has no clean solution. She looked at it from every angle. She ran the numbers because Wren always ran the numbers, and the numbers always told the truth, even when the truth was something you did not want to hear. $500 at a property auction was not a strategy. It was barely a gesture. The properties sold at these auctions, the ones worth having, went for thousands, tens of thousands to contractors and developers who came with financing and plans and the particular confidence of men who had been buying things at auction their entire lives. She told no one, not Margot, who would have asked careful questions Wren did not have answers to, not Lachlan, who would have wanted to come along, not her mother, who would have worried, and whose worry would have made the thing feel more reckless than it already was. On Wednesday night, the night before the auction, Wren sat on the edge of her bed in the Flats apartment at 1 a.m. and called her mother. Judith answered on the second ring. She had always been a light sleeper, and she had been sleeping lighter than usual since the divorce, as if some part of her was permanently tuned to the frequency of her daughter's distress, waiting for the signal that things had gotten worse. Wren did not ease into it. She did not have the energy for preamble. "I am scared, Mom," she said. "I am really scared, and I do not know what I am doing." Judith was quiet for a moment. Not the kind of quiet that means someone is searching for words, the kind of quiet that means someone is choosing the right ones. "Wren," she said, "you were the best planner in this family. Your father and I used to say that you could organize a hurricane. You remember that? That was a long time ago. A plan does not need to be perfect, sweetheart. It just needs to start." Wren pressed the phone against her ear and closed her eyes. The apartment was dark and cold, and the wind was doing what Wyoming wind always does in November, finding every crack and reminding you that shelter is not a permanent condition, but a temporary agreement between you and the weather. "What if it is the wrong start?" Wren asked. "Then you will know," Judith said, "and you will adjust. That is what you have always done. That is what I raised you to do." Wren cried for the second time in 2 days. Quietly, so the sound would not carry through the thin walls to wherever Margot and Lachlan were sleeping, dreaming whatever children dream when they are trying very hard not to worry about things children should not have to worry about. When she hung up, she set the phone on the nightstand and lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, and thought about the green spiral notebook in her parents' garage in Laramie. She thought about the 23-year-old woman who had written in it with such clarity and precision, an unshakable belief that planning was enough, that if you organized your life carefully enough, the world would cooperate. She had been wrong about that. The world did not cooperate. The world did whatever it wanted, and the only thing that mattered was what you did after it finished rearranging everything you had built. Thursday morning arrived cold and flat. the kind of Wyoming November sky that offers no particular promise in any direction. Wren drove Margot and Lachlan to school, said nothing about where she was going afterward, and made her way to the Crestfall County Administration building on her own. The auction room was a low-ceilinged space off the main corridor, with folding chairs arranged in uneven rows and a podium at the front where Phil Durbin, a heavy-set county official with a mustache and the practiced boredom of a man who had done this many times before, shuffled papers and waited for the room to fill. Fluorescent lights hummed above. The room smelled of floor wax and stale coffee, and the particular institutional staleness of a government building that had not been renovated since the decade it was built. Wren counted approximately 25 people when she took her seat near the back. Most were men, fleece jackets and canvas coats and work boots, and the kind of physical ease that comes from being in rooms where you have always belonged. She recognized several of them from the years she had spent attending Garrett's business dinners. Contractors, developers, the men who built things and bought things and decided what Crestfall would become. A few of them turned when she walked in. She saw the recognition move across their faces like a shadow crossing a field. Garrett Holden's ex-wife, the one who got the apartment in the flats. She watched them look away with the particular discomfort of people deciding not to acknowledge something inconvenient. Victor Sable was in the front row. She recognized him immediately. He was the largest private landowner in Crestfall's commercial district, a man in his late 60s who had built his real estate portfolio over 3 decades with the confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged. He sat with his legs crossed and a leather portfolio in his lap, and the expression of a man who had already decided which properties he wanted and was simply waiting for the formality of the auction to confirm what he considered inevitable. Wren sat down near the back and kept her eyes on the front of the room. Durbin worked through the list efficiently. His voice had the cadence of an auctioneer who knew that most of the decisions in this room had been made before anyone sat down. A vacant commercial lot on the north side of town sold for $11,000 to a contractor Wren vaguely recognized. A residential property with foundation issues went for $34,000. A decommissioned storage facility near the highway sold quickly to an investment group that had clearly come prepared with a number and a plan. Each price landed like a door closing. Wren watched them go and did the math she already knew the answer to. 11,000, 34,000. Even the cheapest property in the room was 22 times what she had in her pocket. She was watching a game being played in a currency she did not possess, and the longer she sat there, the more clearly she understood that she had driven across town on a November morning to confirm what she already knew, that $500 was not enough, that she was not a participant in this room, but a spectator, and not even that. She was a woman who had wandered into the wrong place and was about to wander back out with nothing except a slightly sharper understanding of the distance between where she was and where she needed to be. She was about to stand up. She was already reaching for her coat on the back of the chair, already composing in her mind the version of this morning she would tell herself later. The one where going to the auction was a reasonable idea that simply did not work out when Durbin cleared his throat and shuffled to the final page on his clipboard. "A last one for today," he said, in a tone that suggested even he found this one mildly absurd. Property located at the end of Holloway Ridge Road, approximately 4 miles outside Crestfall city limits. Former private bunker structure, concrete construction built approximately 1951. Decommissioned and abandoned since 1973. Sits on 3 acres of unincorporated county land. Condemned due to unknown interior condition. The county has not been able to access the interior for inspection. No utilities, no road improvements, no warranties of any kind. He paused and looked up from the clipboard with the expression of a man reading a menu item he would not personally order. "The county wants this off the books. We will open bidding at $800. Silence. not the expectant silence that precedes a bid. The silence of a room that has collectively decided something is not worth the effort of responding to. One of the contractors near the front said something under his breath that produced quiet laughter from the men around him. Victor Sable glanced at his clipboard, made a small notation, and did not look up. Durbin waited. His pen hovered. The silence extended. Fine, he said. 500. Anyone want 3 acres and a concrete structure for $500? More silence. Someone's phone buzzed. A chair scraped the floor as one of the developers in the middle row stood up and began putting on his jacket, already done with the morning. The auction was over. The real properties had been sold. What remained was a formality no one intended to complete. Wren's hand went up. She did not decide to raise it. That is the truest thing she can say about what happened in that moment, and she has thought about it more times than she can count in the years since. There was no calculation, no strategy, no moment of clarity where the path forward revealed itself in a flash of insight. Her hand went up the way a person's hand goes up when they are drowning and something surfaces within reach, and the body acts before the mind has finished its analysis, because the body understands something the mind is still arguing about. The room did not go immediately silent so much as it lost its footing for a moment. Heads turned, not all at once, but in a ripple the way attention moves through a space when something unexpected has occurred, and people are not yet certain whether they should take it seriously. Durbin looked at her over his clipboard. His expression was not quite surprise and not quite pity, but somewhere in the middle where those two things blur into something that has no clean name. 500, he said. Yes, Wren said. Her voice was steady. She was grateful for that, because nothing else about her was steady in that moment. Her hands were trembling in her lap, and her heart was beating in a way that she could feel in her throat, and the $500 in her coat pocket felt suddenly like it was made of something heavier than paper. Durbin looked around the room. Anyone else? Nobody moved. Victor Sable did not look up from his clipboard. The contractor who had made the joke earlier was watching Wren with an expression of genuine bewilderment, as if she had just performed a card trick that he could not figure out and was not entirely certain was meant to be entertaining. Durbin looked back at Wren. All right then. Condemned bunker structure and 3 acres on Holloway Ridge Road sold for $500. He made a note on his clipboard. Please see Marge at the clerk's desk for paperwork. The laughter started before she had fully stood up. Not all of it was loud. Some of it was the restrained sideways kind that men produce when they want to be amused without being seen as cruel. But it was present and it was unanimous, and it filled the room the way weather fills a valley, settling into every corner without being asked. She heard pieces of it as she walked toward the clerk's desk at the side of the room. She bought the hole in the ground. The bunker. Someone get her a hard hat. Garrett was right about her. That last one was quieter than the others, spoken by someone who perhaps did not intend for her to hear it, or perhaps did. It landed the way certain sentences land, not on the surface, but deeper, in the place where the things people say about you, when they think you are not listening, accumulate like sediment, building up slowly over years until the weight of them becomes part of the landscape of who you believe yourself to be. In the corner of the room, a man in his early 30s with a notebook and a press badge from the Crestfall Courier was writing. Nolan Garvey. He was smiling slightly as he wrote, not with malice exactly, but with the particular amusement of a young journalist who has stumbled onto a story that writes itself. Single mother buys condemned hole in the ground for $500. He was already composing the headline. Marge Colton, the county clerk, was a trim woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the expression of someone who had processed a great deal of other people's business without volunteering opinions about it. She handed Wren the paperwork without ceremony, walked her through each page quietly and efficiently, and when Wren signed the last sheet and passed it back across the desk, Marge held her gaze for just a moment. The kind of moment that lasts slightly longer than professional necessity requires. The key is an old one, Marge said, sliding a single iron key across the counter. It was heavy blackened, with age rusted at the bow. It looked less like a key and more like something archaeological, something recovered from a site rather than handed across a government desk. We do not have a copy. Whatever is in there is yours now. Wren closed her hand around the key. It was cold and heavy, and it sat in her palm with the particular weight of things whose significance has not yet been determined. She picked up her copy of the deed, folded it carefully, and placed it in her coat pocket beside the key and the empty space where $500 had been. She walked back through the lobby. Behind her, someone was already texting. She could hear the faint, rapid tapping of thumbs on glass, the sound of her humiliation being transmitted outward at the speed of modern communication. By that evening, the story had made its way through most of Crestfall, the way stories do in small towns, not through any single channel, but through the accumulated murmur of people who had been in the room, and people who knew people who had been in the room, and people who simply found the thing too remarkable not to repeat. Garrett Holden's ex-wife bought a condemned hole in the ground for her last $500. Can you believe it? Wren sat in her apartment that night after the children were in bed and held the iron key in both hands and looked at it for a long time. The key was old, older than her marriage, older than the version of herself who had written a 5-year plan in a green spiral notebook and believed that the world could be organized into cooperation. The key was from 1951. It had been waiting for 72 years for someone to use it, and now it belonged to a woman with no money and no plan, and 4 days left on her apartment lease. She did not know what was behind the door it opened. She did not know if the bunker was habitable or salvageable, or anything other than the condemned concrete hole that everyone in Crestfall seemed certain it was. But she knew something else. She knew it with the particular clarity that comes not from wisdom or insight, but from the complete absence of alternatives. She had spent her last $500. She had nothing left to protect by being cautious. The laughter in the auction room, the smug text from Garrett, she had not opened the quiet pity of people who had watched her life come apart and found it confirming rather than troubling. None of it could take anything more from her because there was nothing more to take. She had a key. She had a deed. She had 3 acres of Wyoming hillside and a sealed concrete structure that no one had entered in over 7 decades. And she had 2 children sleeping in the next room who were depending on her to find a way forward through a landscape that offered no visible path. Tomorrow she would drive to Holloway Ridge Road. She would put the key in the lock. She would open the door. And whatever was on the other side of it, whatever waited in the dark behind 72 years of sealed concrete and rusted steel, she would face it the way Boyd and Judith Calloway had taught their daughters to face everything. Standing up, eyes open, one step at a time. The wind hit the windows of the Flats apartment. The building creaked. Somewhere outside, a dog barked once and then was quiet. Wren set the key on the nightstand beside her phone, turned off the second-hand lamp, and lay in the dark, listening to the sound of the building settling around her, the small mechanical sounds of a structure holding itself together through another Wyoming night. She did not sleep for a long time, but she did not cry. She was done with that part. Whatever came next would require something other than tears. It would require the thing she had been raised on, the thing that Boyd and Judith had built into her bones like rebar in concrete, the thing that 18 years of marriage and 9 months of divorce proceedings and 3 months of freefall had not managed to remove. It would require her to show up. The road to Holloway Ridge was not so much a road as a memory of one. 2 tire tracks pressed into the earth at some point in the distant past, now half swallowed by dry grass and sage and the slow, patient encroachment of land, reclaiming what had been briefly taken from it. The tracks wound uphill through a corridor of scrub oak and juniper that grew denser as the elevation increased, the branches reaching across the gap between the ruts like fingers lacing together until the canopy above was thick enough to block most of the gray November sky, and the light that filtered through had the quality of something seen through old glass. Wren drove her aging Subaru as far as she could, which turned out to be about 3/4 of a mile from the highway before the undergrowth became impractical and the ground beneath the tires softened into something that was no longer road and not yet trail but existed in the uncertain space between the two. She cut the engine and sat for a moment looking through the windshield at the hillside above her. Margot was in the passenger seat, Lachlan was in the back. Neither of them had asked many questions when Wren told them that morning where they were going. Margot had simply nodded and put on her coat and waited by the door, and Lachlan had grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer without being told to, which was the kind of quiet, practical instinct that reminded Wren so much of her father that it produced a small, sharp ache in her chest every time she noticed it. They walked the remaining distance in single file. Wren in front, Lachlan behind her, Margot bringing up the rear with her arms crossed against the cold, and her expression held in careful neutral, which was how Margot's face looked when she was thinking hard about something she had not yet decided whether to say out loud. The path, such as it was, rose steeply for the last 100 yards, and then leveled out onto a small plateau cut into the side of the hill, and there it was. The bunker was not what Wren had pictured, though she was not certain what she had pictured exactly. Perhaps something military and angular with the clean lines of a structure built according to government specifications. What she found instead was something more personal and more peculiar. It was a low concrete structure, longer than it was tall, set into the hillside like something the earth had partially swallowed and then decided to keep. The concrete was stained dark in long vertical streaks from decades of rainwater finding its way down the walls. Rusted ventilation pipes rose from the flat roof at irregular intervals, several of them bent at odd angles, one missing entirely, leaving a dark circular opening in the concrete that looked like the socket of a pulled tooth. A heavy steel door sat recessed into the front face of the structure, set back about 2 feet into a concrete frame that gave it the appearance of something designed to withstand more than weather. The door was secured by a lock mechanism so corroded it looked almost geological, as if it had been growing there, rather than installed. Juniper and scrub oak had grown up around the base of the walls on 3 sides, and a thin layer of lichen covered most of the concrete surface, giving the whole structure a mottled green-gray complexion that made it look less built than geological, like an outcropping, like something the hill had produced on its own. The whole place had the particular stillness of somewhere that had not been disturbed in a very long time. Not abandoned stillness which carries the residue of departure, the sense that someone left and the leaving is the most recent thing that happened. This was deeper than that. This was the stillness of a place that had been deliberately sealed and then forgotten, a place where the last human act had been the act of closing, and everything since had been silence and weather and the slow work of time, doing what time does to things left alone. Margot stood beside the car with her arms crossed and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. Lachlan walked a slow circle around the visible perimeter of the structure, one hand trailing along the concrete wall, pressing against it in places as if testing whether it was real, whether the solidity of it could be trusted. He came around the far side and looked at his mother with an expression that Wren would remember for the rest of her life. Not excitement, not disappointment, something more fundamental than either of those. "It is solid," he said, "like genuinely solid. They built this thing to last." That was the first useful thing anyone had said about the property at the end of Holloway Ridge Road, and Wren held on to it the way a person in deep water holds on to anything that floats. Before we continue, make sure you are subscribed, because what Wren finds inside this bunker changes everything. And leave a comment telling us, would you have raised your hand in that auction room? Now back to the story. She spent the better part of an hour working the lock. The iron key from Marge's desk fit into the mechanism, but the mechanism itself was so corroded that the key would not turn at all for the first 40 minutes. Wren worked at it methodically, the way she had once worked through accounting problems, the way her mother graded papers with patience and repetition, and the belief that persistence applied correctly to a problem would eventually produce a result. She used a can of lubricant she found in the back of the Subaru, applying it in small amounts, letting it seep into the lock mechanism, then wiggling the key with steady pressure, not forcing it, not yanking, just maintaining the kind of constant patient force that either breaks things or opens them. Something deep inside the lock released, with a sound like a bone settling into a joint. The handle turned. The door did not open, but it was no longer locked, and the difference between those two things felt enormous. The door required both of them, Wren and Lachlan, bracing their weight against the steel edge while Margot watched from a careful distance. The hinges screamed. That is the only accurate word for the sound they produced. Decades of disuse and corrosion had fused the metal surfaces together, and separating them produced a noise that echoed off the hillside and sent a pair of birds erupting from the juniper thicket to the west, their wings beating against the cold air like applause in an empty theater. The door opened inward slowly, reluctantly, as if the structure itself was uncertain about being entered after so long. And the air that came out was unlike anything Wren had encountered before, cold and dense and carrying the specific quality of a sealed space, a room that had been breathing its own air for 7 decades. Not the rot of decay, not mold or mildew or the biological smell of things breaking down, something drier and older than that. The smell of concrete and time and the particular stillness of a room that had been waiting. Wren shone her phone light inside. The bunker was a single main corridor, approximately 40 feet long, stretching straight back into the hillside. 3 rooms branched off it, 2 on the left side, and 1 larger one at the far end. The walls were bare concrete, smooth and intact. The floor was the same. No water damage, no collapsed sections, no evidence of animal intrusion or structural failure. The sealed door and the hillside insulation had done exactly what they were designed to do. Everything was dry and sound and solid in a way that the house she had lost in the divorce had never quite managed to be. They moved through it carefully. Wren first, Lachlan behind her, with the flashlight, Margot following at a distance that gradually shortened as her caution gave way to curiosity. The first 2 side rooms were empty except for metal shelving units bolted to the walls. Military grade, heavy gauge steel still perfectly anchored without a trace of rust on the interior surfaces. Whoever had built this place had understood something about preservation that went beyond ordinary construction. Every surface, every joint, every connection point had been designed to endure. The main room at the far end was larger, perhaps 20 feet square, with a ventilation system mounted near the ceiling that consisted of metal ductwork and a manual crank mechanism that had not been turned in longer than Wren had been alive. A heavy wooden table sat in the center of the room, positioned with the kind of deliberateness that suggested it was not furniture, but a workstation, a place where something specific and important had been done. The wood was dark with age, but solid. No warping, no rot. The sealed environment had preserved it perfectly. On the metal shelving units along the far wall sat rows of storage cases. Metal, sealed, stacked with a precision that spoke of intention rather than haste. Someone had placed these cases here with great care and in a specific order, and then they had closed the door and locked it and left them in the dark for 72 years. Margot counted them quietly, the way she counted things when she was nervous, using numbers as a structure to stand inside, while the rest of her mind processed something it was not ready to articulate. 14, she said. 14 cases. Lachlan moved toward the lower shelves and tried to lift one of the cases, his arms strained. He looked at his mother with an expression that lived somewhere between surprise and alarm. "Mom," he said, "this one is heavy." But Wren was not looking at the cases. She had crossed the room to the table, because sitting on its surface, partially obscured by a thin layer of dust so fine it looked almost like frost, was a single item, a leather folio, the kind used for documents. Its cover was cracked with age but intact, held shut by a corroded brass clasp, and embossed on the front, just barely visible through the grime and the years, were two letters: E.W. Wren set her phone on the table with the light facing upward, casting long shadows across the concrete ceiling. She reached for the folio with hands that were not entirely steady. The clasp resisted for only a moment, the brass giving way with a small sound like a sigh, and the leather cover fell open. Inside were pages, dense handwritten, covering both sides of each sheet in a small and careful script that had the quality of something written by a person who understood that every word mattered, and that space was not infinite, and that what was being recorded needed to survive the recording. The ink had faded from black to a deep brown, but it was legible. Every word of it was legible. At the top of the first page, underlined twice in a hand that pressed hard enough to leave grooves in the paper, were words that made the room feel suddenly and irrevocably smaller. To whoever finds this, what is sealed in this room does not belong to the government. It never did. And I have spent 30 years making certain they cannot have it back. Wren read for 3 hours without stopping. She sat on the concrete floor of the bunker's main room, with her back against the wall and her phone propped against the edge of the table, for light, turning each page of the folio with the careful attention of someone who understands they are handling something that will not survive carelessness. The pages were fragile but intact. The sealed environment had done its work. Every word written by the man who had built this room was as clear and precise as the day he had set his pen down for the last time. Margot sat beside her, reading along in silence. Lachlan had positioned himself near the door of the main room, keeping watch on the darkening corridor and the rectangle of gray daylight visible at the far end, where the bunker opened onto the hillside. He had assumed this position without being asked, with the quiet seriousness of a 14-year-old boy who understood that his job right now was not to read but to guard, and who performed that job with the kind of instinctive dignity that made Wren's heart ache with a pride she did not have time to express. The man who had built the bunker was named Elias Jefferson Whitfield. He had been born in Cheyenne in 1901, the son of a railroad surveyor and a woman who had taught herself engineering from borrowed textbooks because the universities of her era would not admit her. He had inherited her aptitude and her stubbornness in equal measure, and he had spent the first 2 decades of his adult life as a private geological engineer, contracting with mining companies and land developers across Wyoming and Montana to survey subsurface formations and assess extraction potential. He was, by every account he gave of himself in the folio, and the accounts were remarkably free of vanity, exceptionally good at what he did. He understood the language of rock and pressure and time, the way Wren understood the language of numbers and balance sheets, with an instinctive fluency that went beyond training into something closer to kinship with the subject itself. He was also, by his own frank admission, a man who had made the mistake of being too good at his work in the presence of people who valued the work but not the man who produced it. In 1947, Elias Whitfield had been contracted by a private energy consortium operating out of Denver, a group of investors with government connections and the kind of financial backing that allows certain organizations to operate in the space between private enterprise and public authority without being clearly identifiable as either. They were in the early stages of what would become a significant natural gas extraction operation across the Wyoming basin, and they needed a geological survey of a specific corridor of land. Elias's assignment was to survey a 20-mile corridor running through Crestfall County and produce a detailed assessment of its subsurface mineral potential. He had done this thoroughly and correctly, and with the meticulous precision that characterized everything he touched, and what he found had astonished him. Beneath the surface of the land running from the Big Horn foothills through the eastern edge of what was then unincorporated Crestfall County lay one of the most significant natural gas formations he had encountered in 30 years of survey work. The formation was extensive, well-defined, and commercially viable on a scale that dwarfed anything currently being extracted in the region. He documented everything: the formation depth, the estimated reserves, the geological mapping of the entire corridor, and he filed his findings with both the consortium and critically with the Wyoming State Geological Survey in Cheyenne under his own name, as was his professional right under the terms of his contract. What happened next was the kind of thing that happened with some regularity in that era to people who discovered valuable things in the presence of more powerful people. The consortium moved quickly. They filed extraction claims on the land using Elias's survey data while simultaneously producing a revised version of their contract with him, a version that stripped his name from the findings and reclassified his work as proprietary property of the consortium itself. The revised contract bore a signature that Elias maintained was forged. The consortium maintained it was genuine. They had lawyers in Denver and relationships with county officials in Crestfall, and the kind of institutional weight that makes the question of whose signature is real and whose is forged into a question that only one side has the resources to answer. Elias fought it for 4 years through state channels. He lost at every level. The courts in Crestfall County were presided over by judges who knew the consortium's principals by their first names, who had been hunting with them and dining with them and receiving their campaign contributions for years before Elias Whitfield walked into their courtrooms with his survey data and his original contract and his stubborn, righteous belief that the truth would be sufficient. It was not sufficient. The truth he learned was only as powerful as the institutions willing to enforce it, and the institutions in Crestfall County were not willing. By 1951, Elias had exhausted his legal options and nearly all of his savings, but he had not surrendered his records. He built the bunker that year with the help of 2 men. He trusted completely, men whose names he did not record in the folio for their own protection, and he sealed inside it everything he had. The original survey documentation filed under his name with the state, the unaltered version of his contract, correspondence between consortium members, discussing in frank and incriminating language how to manage his objections and neutralize his claims, and the 14 sealed cases that contained his original survey equipment, geological core samples, and the precise technical data that proved beyond any reasonable dispute that his findings were his. He wrote the folio as both a record and an instruction addressed to whoever found it, laying out in clear and methodical language exactly what each case contained and exactly what it proved. But the most significant document in the folio was not about the past. It was about the future. Elias, anticipating that his legal battle would outlast him, had filed a mineral rights claim through the state of Wyoming. Not through Crestfall County, where the corruption was concentrated like poison in a well, but directly through the state office in Cheyenne, where the filing clerks did not know the consortium's principles, and the records were maintained with the impersonal efficiency of a bureaucracy that was too large to be easily corrupted. He had established through this filing that the natural gas formation he had discovered and documented was subject to his prior claim under Wyoming extraction law. And then he had done something that Wren read 3 times before she fully understood its implications. He had attached this filing to the deed of the 3-acre property on Holloway Ridge Road, creating a legal instrument that tied the mineral rights claim permanently and irrevocably to whoever held title to the land. The land title now belonged to Wren Calloway. Wren pulled up Wyoming property law on her phone with hands that were trembling badly enough that she had to set the phone on the floor to read the screen. She cross-referenced what she was reading against what Elias had written. The language in the folio was precise and deliberate, the language of a man who had spent 4 years in courtrooms and understood exactly what legal terminology was required to make an instrument hold. The mineral rights were attached to the land title. The land title had been transferred through the county auction. The transfer was legally executed and recorded. Margot looked at her mother in the low light of the bunker. The phone light threw shadows upward across their faces, and the concrete walls made every sound feel close and significant. Mom, Margot said carefully, what is under Crestfall right now? Wren set the folio down on the concrete floor. She pressed both hands flat against her knees and held them there until the shaking stopped, or at least until it reduced to something she could manage. A natural gas formation, she said quietly, one of the most significant in this part of Wyoming. And according to everything in this room, the mineral rights to that formation have belonged to Elias Whitfield's estate for over 70 years. She paused. And now they belong to us. Margot was quiet for a long time. Lachlan, who had been listening from his post near the door, turned and looked at his mother with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was the expression of a boy who has just understood something about the world that is larger than anything he was prepared to understand, and who was trying very hard to hold it without dropping it. The silence in the bunker was absolute. No wind reached this deep into the hill. No sound from the outside world penetrated the concrete. It was just the three of them, and the pages of a dead man's testimony, and the weight of something that had been waiting in the dark for longer than any of them had been alive. Wren gathered the folio carefully. She stood up. She looked at her children. We are not telling anyone about this yet, she said. Not anyone. Do you understand? They understood. The next 5 days were the most focused of Wren's life. She arrived at the Crestfall Public Library when it opened each morning and stayed until the librarian turned off the lights. She sat at the same table in the reference section, surrounded by printouts and legal texts and her own handwritten notes, and she worked through every document in Elias Whitfield's folio against every piece of Wyoming mineral rights law she could locate. She made photocopies of everything. She stored copies in 3 separate locations, 2 of which she told no one about because Wren had read enough of Elias's story to understand that the people who had stolen from him had been thorough, and she intended to be more thorough than they were. She photographed every page of the folio on her phone, uploaded the images to a cloud account she created specifically for this purpose, and mailed a physical copy of the most critical documents to her mother in Laramie with a note that said simply, "Keep this safe and do not open it unless I ask you to." On the morning of the 3rd day in the library, Nolan Garvey's article appeared in the Crestfall Courier. It was short. It was positioned in the local interest section between a story about a school board meeting and an advertisement for winter tire services. The headline read, "Local woman purchases condemned bunker at county auction for $500. The tone was light, amused, the kind of gentle mockery that small-town newspapers produce when something happens that does not fit the usual categories, and the reporter is young enough to find the incongruity entertaining rather than meaningful. Garvey had included Wren's name and a brief summary of the auction and a quote from an unnamed attendee who described the purchase as optimistic. Wren read the article in the library, sitting at her usual table, and felt nothing about it except a small, cold clarity. The article itself was harmless, but articles travel, and in small towns they travel to the people who pay the most attention to the things other people acquire and the reasons they might have acquired them. The article reached Victor Sable before the end of the day. Sable did not care about the bunker. The bunker was a condemned concrete box in the hills, and Victor Sable had not built his real estate empire by investing in condemned concrete boxes. What Sable cared about was the 3 acres of land the bunker sat on, because those 3 acres occupied a very specific position on the map. They sat directly on the path of an expansion corridor that Meridian Energy, the largest natural gas operation in the county, was in the process of permitting. Sable owned commercial properties along that corridor. The expansion would increase their value significantly, and 3 acres of uncontrolled land in the middle of that corridor, owned by an unpredictable woman with no obvious financial resources, was the kind of variable that men like Victor Sable preferred to eliminate early. 2 days after the article appeared, Lachlan rode his bicycle to the bunker after school. He had been doing this since the day they first opened it, bringing food for his mother when she worked late at the library, checking on the property with the proprietary seriousness of a 14-year-old who has decided that something belongs to his family and therefore falls under his protection. He found footprints around the bunker door, fresh ones, boot prints in the mud that did not match his own or his mother's or Margot's. And on the new padlock Wren had installed the day after the auction, he found scratch marks, small metallic scratches around the keyhole, the kind produced by someone testing a lock they do not have the key to. Lachlan called his mother immediately. Wren was at the library. She left without closing her books. She drove to Holloway Ridge in 14 minutes, which was faster than the road safely allowed, and she checked the interior of the bunker with her hands shaking and her breath coming in short, controlled bursts that she recognized as the beginning of a panic she could not afford to have. Everything was still there. The folio, the cases, the shelving. Nothing had been moved. The lock had held. Whoever had come had tested the door and found it secured and left. But the message was clear. Someone was interested, and the window of time between now and the moment when interested became informed was closing. That night, after their children were asleep, Wren sat on the floor of the bunker with the folio in her lap and photographed every remaining document she had not yet copied. She transferred the images to 3 separate devices. She drove to the post office in the next town and mailed a second package to her mother. She placed the most critical original documents, the mineral rights filing, and the deed attachment inside one of Elias's own metal cases and stored it on the highest shelf in the bunker behind the other cases where it would not be the first thing found by someone searching quickly. These precautions took her until 2 in the morning. She drove back to the Flats apartment in the dark, let herself in quietly, and stood in the kitchen for several minutes, looking at nothing before she sat down at the table and opened her laptop. She searched the Wyoming State Bar Directory for attorneys specializing in mineral rights litigation who did not have existing relationships with Crestfall's business community. This was a specific search, and it produced a short list. Most energy lawyers in Wyoming had at some point in their careers worked with or against the companies operating in the region's extraction corridors, and most of those relationships created conflicts of interest that would compromise the case she needed to build. One name kept appearing in case records without appearing in Crestfall social directories. Russell Cope, solo practice, Sheridan, Wyoming, 2 hours north. Energy law, property disputes, the subsurface rights. A man who had built his career handling the kind of complicated, contentious mineral rights cases that larger firms avoided because the outcomes were uncertain and the opponents were wealthy, and the work required a tolerance for hostility that most attorneys preferred not to develop. On the 5th day, Wren called his office. His assistant, a woman with a measured voice and the careful diction of someone who fielded a great many calls from a great many people who believed their situations were urgent, told Wren that Mr. Cope was fully committed for the foreseeable future and was not accepting new consultations. Wren said she understood. Then she said, "Please tell him that I have original documentation of a mineral rights claim predating every extraction agreement currently operating in Crestfall County. I will hold." The assistant was quiet for a moment, then she put Wren on hold. The hold lasted 45 seconds. When the assistant returned, her voice had changed in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, the way a voice changes when the person speaking has just been told something that rearranges their assessment of the situation. "Mr. Cope can see you at 8 tomorrow morning," she said. "Bring everything." Russell Cope was a spare, precise man in his late 50s who wore reading glasses on the end of his nose and had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent decades in rooms where a great deal of money was at stake, and where the difference between winning and losing often came down to who could sit quietly the longest without revealing what they were thinking. His office in Sheridan was small and orderly, lined with case files and legal texts, and it had the atmosphere of a place where serious work was done by someone who did not require a large audience for the doing of it. He spread Elias Whitfield's documents across his conference table and examined each one without speaking for nearly 2 hours while Wren sat across from him and waited. She did not fill the silence. She did not explain or contextualize or narrate. She had spent 5 days preparing for this meeting, and she understood that the documents needed to speak for themselves and that any lawyer worth hiring would need to hear them without interference. When Cope finally looked up, his expression was controlled in the way of someone making a deliberate effort to remain professional in the presence of something extraordinary. He had removed his glasses and was holding them in one hand, which Wren later learned was a habit he displayed only when a case had genuinely surprised him, which did not happen often. "This filing with the state," he said, tapping the mineral rights document with one finger. "This is real. It was properly executed, and it is on record in Cheyenne. I confirmed it while you were sitting here." He paused. "Do you understand what this formation runs beneath?" Wren nodded. "The commercial district, the resort development on the eastern edge of town. And if his survey maps are accurate, a significant portion of the extraction corridor currently being operated by Meridian Energy under leases granted by the county." Cope set his glasses on the table. "Meridian Energy is the largest natural gas operation in this county. Their parent company has revenues that make the entire municipal budget of Crestfall look like a rounding error." "I know," Wren said. "If this holds up," Cope said slowly, "every extraction lease Meridian is operating under in that corridor is built on a mineral rights claim that was never legally theirs to grant. The county leased them rights to something the county did not own." "When do we file?" Wren asked. Cope studied her across the table. She could see him assessing her, not her case but her, measuring the distance between the woman sitting in front of him and the fight she was proposing to walk into, calculating whether she understood what she was asking for. "I need 2 weeks to prepare this properly," he said, "and I need you to understand something before we proceed. What you are about to do is going to make you very unpopular with very powerful people very quickly. Meridian has a legal team that could fill this building. The county will fight this. Victor Sable and every property owner along that corridor will fight this. This is not going to be a quiet process." "I have been unpopular with powerful people before," Wren said. "I survived that too." Cope allowed himself a small, careful smile. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting a long time for a case like this, and a client who meant what she said. 2 weeks, huh?" he said. "Then we file." During those 2 weeks, Cope did something Wren had not asked him to do, but that would change the trajectory of the case in ways neither of them could have predicted. In the course of verifying Elias Whitfield's estate records through state archives, he found a living descendant, Dorothea Whitfield, 78 years old, living alone in a small house in Casper. Elias's granddaughter, the daughter of his only child, a woman named Ruth, who had died in 1994. Cope called Dorothea. She listened to what he had to say, and then in a voice that Cope later described to Wren as containing 50 years of something compressed into a single sentence, she said, "I cannot help you. My grandfather was a troubled man who spent the last 20 years of his life obsessed with a conspiracy that did not exist. My family was very clear about this. I am sorry." She hung up. Cope relayed the conversation to Wren. He suggested that Dorothea's testimony, while potentially powerful, was not legally necessary, and that they could proceed without it. The documents were strong enough on their own. Wren listened. She understood the legal calculus. She also understood something that Cope, for all his precision and experience, did not. She understood what it felt like to spend your life being told a version of the truth by people whose authority you did not question, and to discover one day that the version was wrong, and that the people telling it had been wrong too, and that the person you had dismissed or doubted or quietly given up on had been right all along. She drove to Casper the next morning, 3 hours each way. She did not call ahead. Dorothea Whitfield answered her door in a cardigan and house slippers and looked at Wren with the guarded expression of a woman who had been visited by enough strangers in her life to be cautious about new ones. She was small and straight-backed, and her eyes had the particular clarity of very old people who have stopped pretending to be interested in things that do not matter to them. Wren did not introduce herself as a client of Russell Cope. She did not mention the case or the mineral rights or the formation beneath Crestfall. She reached into her bag and took out a photocopied page from Elias's folio, the first page, the one that began with the words, "To whoever finds this," and she held it out. "Your grandfather wrote this," Wren said. "I found it in a bunker he built in 1951 on a hill outside Crestfall. I read every word of it. He was not troubled. He was not delusional. He was a man who was stolen from, and who spent the rest of his life making sure the truth survived him." Dorothea looked at the page but did not take it. Her hand was at her side, and her fingers were trembling slightly, and her face had the expression of someone standing at the edge of something they have spent a lifetime avoiding. "Please," Wren said, "just read it." Dorothea took the page. She sat down at her kitchen table and she read it, and then she read it again, and on the third reading she set the page down on the table and placed both hands flat on the surface and closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet, and she did not wipe them. "My mother told me he was paranoid, Dorothea said quietly. She said the lawsuit broke something in him, that the bunker was proof he had lost touch with reality. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, someone in the family would say, 'Poor Elias and I believed them. I believed them for 50 years. She stood up slowly and left the room. When she came back, she was carrying a tin box, the kind that might have once held biscuits or sewing supplies. She set it on the table and opened it. Inside, tied with a piece of kitchen string that had gone brittle with age, were letters, handwritten, dated from 1955 to 1967. Letters from Elias to his daughter Ruth, Dorothea's mother, describing the bunker, describing what he had sealed inside it, describing his belief that the truth would eventually surface in the hands of someone who needed it. "My mother kept these," Dorothea said. "She kept them, but she did not believe them. She thought they were evidence of his illness." She looked at Wren across the kitchen table. They were evidence that he was right. He was right about everything. Dorothea agreed to testify. Wren drove back to Crestfall that evening with the letters carefully stored in a folder on the passenger seat, and something in her chest that she could not name but that felt solid and warm and heavy, like a stone that had been heated by a fire and placed in her coat to carry. The next morning, Victor Sable appeared at her apartment door. He wore an expensive coat and an expression that was working hard to remain pleasant in the way that certain expressions work hard at things that do not come naturally to them. He stood on her doorstep in the cold morning air with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders squared, and the practiced ease of a man who was accustomed to making offers that people accepted, because the alternative to accepting them was always implied clearly enough that it did not need to be stated. He offered her $400,000 to drop the claim and walk away quietly. He framed it as generosity. He used the word opportunity twice. He implied, without saying directly, that the alternative to accepting his generosity would involve a lengthy, expensive, and deeply unpleasant legal process that a woman in her financial position could not realistically sustain. He mentioned her children, not by name, just her children in the abstract, the way people mention children when they want the mention to function as leverage rather than concern. Wren stood in her doorway and looked at him with the particular calm of someone who had already been through the worst version of this kind of conversation and had survived it and had come out the other side with a clear understanding of exactly how much the concern of powerful men was worth when it was offered in the same breath as a threat. "Mr. Sable," she said, "Russell Cope tells me that the extraction royalties alone from the Whitfield Formation, calculated at current market rates, represent a claim worth somewhere between $40 and $80 million. She paused long enough to let the number settle. "So I am going to need you to go back to whoever sent you and tell them that we are not interested in 400,000. She closed the door before he could respond. That night, Wren drove to the bunker alone. The road to Holloway Ridge was dark and the wind was moving through the junipers with the low, constant sound that Wyoming wind makes when it has decided to stay. She unlocked the door and went inside and sat at Elias Whitfield's table in the concrete room where he had once sat and written his last testament by lamplight, and she opened the folio to the last page. The final thing Elias had written in handwriting that was slightly less steady than the pages that preceded it, the handwriting of a man who understood. He was setting down his pen for the last time, read simply, "I do not know who you are, but I know you were not supposed to find this, and I know that means you needed it." Wren sat with those words for a long time. The bunker was silent. The concrete held its temperature. The 14 cases sat on their shelves, in the darkness behind her, sealed and patient, waiting, the way they had been waiting for 72 years, the way Elias had trusted they would wait. Then she opened her bag and took out a notebook. Not a green spiral one, a plain composition book she had bought at the drugstore that morning for $1.29. And for the first time in 20 years, Wren Calloway began to write. Not a 5-year plan, not a strategy document, not a list of objectives or timelines or measurable outcomes. She wrote a letter, addressed to Elias Whitfield, a man she had never met and would never meet, who had died in 1968 in a small house in Cheyenne, believing that no one would ever open the door he had sealed, and who had been wrong about that in the best possible way. She told him she had found it. She told him she understood. She told him that the truth he had buried in concrete and darkness and silence was not going to be buried anymore. She told him about Dorothea, about the letters in the tin box, about the 50 years his own granddaughter had spent believing he was broken when he had been the most whole person in the room. She told him that she was going to finish what he had started, not because of the money, not because of the settlement or the mineral rights or the formation beneath Crestfall, but because she understood now, sitting in his room, at his table, reading his words, what it meant to build something designed to outlast the people who tried to destroy it. She closed the notebook and placed it in her bag. She locked the bunker door behind her. She drove back to the Flats apartment in the dark, and the next morning, Russell Cope filed the claim. The filing hit the public record on a Wednesday morning, entered into the state system at 9:07 a.m. by a clerk in Cheyenne who processed it with the same mechanical efficiency she applied to everything that crossed her desk, and who had no way of knowing that the document she was stamping and scanning and entering into the database would within 48 hours detonate through a small Wyoming town, like something structural giving way beneath a building everyone had assumed was standing on solid ground. By Thursday morning, the story had been picked up by the Wyoming Tribune. A reporter in the Cheyenne Bureau had been monitoring state filings as part of a long-running series on mineral rights disputes in the basin, and Cope's filing with its extraordinary claim that a single prior rights instrument predated and potentially invalidated decades of extraction agreements in Crestfall County had triggered every alert the reporter had set. The article that ran on Thursday was factual and restrained and carried the particular energy of a story that the journalist knew was going to get much larger than the space currently allocated to it. By Friday, the story had reached National Energy Industry Publications. The headlines had the slightly disbelieving quality of stories that seem too improbable to be true, and then turn out to be true in ways that make the improbability feel less like coincidence and more like the universe correcting an error it had been meaning to get around to for 7 decades. Single mother's $500 bunker purchase may invalidate decades of natural gas extraction agreements. Wyoming mineral rights case traces claim to 1951, bunker sealed for 72 years. Condemned property auction yields geological survey worth millions in disputed extraction corridor. Nolan Garvey read the filing at his desk at the Crestfall Courier on Thursday afternoon. He read it twice. Then he closed his laptop and sat very still for several minutes, which was unusual for Garvey, who was ordinarily a man of constant, slightly nervous motion, the kind of young journalist who tapped his pen on his desk and jiggled his knee under the table and generally conducted himself with the restless energy of someone who believed that the next story was always about to happen and that sitting still was a form of missing it. He was not sitting still because he was calm. He was sitting still because he was recalculating. 2 weeks earlier, he had written a short amuse piece about a woman who had spent her last $500 on a condemned hole in the ground, and he had written it with the comfortable certainty of someone who understood the shape of the story he was telling. It was a human interest piece, a curiosity, the kind of thing that filled space between real stories and gave readers something to shake their heads at over breakfast. He had been wrong. He had been wrong in the specific and uncomfortable way that journalists are wrong when they mistake the surface of a story for its substance, when they look at a person and see a category rather than an individual, when they write the easy version because the real version would have required them to ask better questions and wait longer for the answers. He picked up his phone and called Wren Calloway. Wren answered on the fourth ring. She knew who was calling. She had seen the article. She had read every word of it on the day it was published, sitting at her table in the library, and she had felt nothing about it except a quiet notation in the part of her mind that catalogued the actions of people who had underestimated her, a catalogue that had grown considerably over the past 3 months, and that she maintained not out of bitterness but out of the practical understanding that knowing who had underestimated you was useful information when you were preparing to prove them wrong. I owe you an apology, Garvey said. The piece I wrote was dismissive and I should have done better. Yes, Wren said, you should have. I would like to write the real story, if you are willing to talk to me. Wren was quiet for a moment. She could have said no. She had said no to most of the reporters who had called in the past 2 days because most of them wanted the version of the story that was already circulating, the improbable fairy tale of the desperate woman and the magic bunker, and Wren had no interest in being the protagonist of a fairy tale. Fairy tales required you to be helpless before the miracle arrived, and Wren had not been helpless. She had been strategic. There was a difference, and it mattered. But Garvey was local. He had been in the auction room. He had seen the laughter and been part of it, and now he was calling to say he had been wrong. And there was something in his voice that Wren recognized, the sound of a person who has been confronted with the distance between who they thought they were and who they actually were, and who was trying to close that distance rather than pretend it does not exist. She knew that sound. She had been making it herself for the past 3 months. One condition, she said, write the truth, not the version that gets the most clicks. The truth. Yes, Garvey said. I can do that. The coalition that formed against Wren assembled itself with the speed and coordination of an organism responding to a threat. Meridian Energy. The largest natural gas operation in the county, a subsidiary of a national energy company with revenues that dwarf the entire municipal budget of Crestfall several times over, retained a legal team of 11 attorneys from a firm in Denver that specialized in extraction rights defense. Victor Sable organized the commercial property owners along the disputed corridor into a consortium that pooled resources for a unified legal response. The Crestfall County government, which had granted the extraction leases that Wren's claim now challenged, joined the opposition as an interested party represented by the county attorney's office and 2 outside counsel hired specifically for the case. Against this, Wren had Russell Cope, 1 attorney, 1 office in Sheridan, 1 conference table. The coalition filed 3 separate motions to dismiss Cope's claim. The first argued that the original 1951 filing was procedurally deficient and therefore unenforceable. The second argued that the statute of limitations on mineral rights claims had long since expired. The third argued that the chain of title from Elias Whitfield's estate to the 3-acre property had been broken by the county's condemnation and subsequent auction of the land, effectively severing the mineral rights attachment. Cope responded to all three within a week. Each response was thorough enough, precise enough, and grounded in enough case law that Judge Renfield, a state district court appointee who had no existing relationship with Crestfall's business community and who had been assigned the case specifically because of her independence, declined to dismiss on any of the three grounds and scheduled a formal hearing. The hearing was set for 6 weeks out, 6 weeks that Wren would later describe as the strangest of her life, though the word strange did not fully capture the quality of those days. She was still living in the Flats apartment, still shopping at the discount grocery store on the south end of town, still driving the aging Subaru with the cracked rear bumper and the heater that worked on 3 of its 4 settings. Nothing about her daily material circumstances had changed. She still counted the money in her wallet before entering the grocery store. She still calculated the cost of every item before putting it in the cart. She still drove past the houses in Millbrook on her way to drop the children at school and felt the particular weight of looking at a life that had once been hers and was now someone else's. And yet the world around her had shifted in a way that she could feel but not yet see, the way you feel the barometric pressure drop before a storm arrives, the way the air changes quality before the weather changes character. Reporters called. Most of them she declined. She spoke only to a journalist from a women's magazine in Denver who had covered mineral rights disputes before and who understood the legal landscape well enough to report the story accurately without turning it into something it was not. The piece that ran described Wren simply and honestly: the divorce, the settlement, the auction, the bunker, the folio, the formation, and let the facts carry the weight without embellishment. Because the facts were already remarkable enough without embellishment, and the journalist understood that the most powerful version of a true story is the one that trusts the reader to recognize the power without being told where to find it. The piece was shared widely. Letters began arriving at Cope's office from people across Wyoming and beyond who had been following the case. Many of them were from women in circumstances not entirely unlike Wren's own, women who had been outmaneuvered by better-funded attorneys in divorce proceedings, women who had watched their contributions to partnerships and businesses and marriages get absorbed into someone else's name and someone else's legal structure. Women who had started over with less than they deserved and more than they could carry, and who recognized in Wren's story something that felt less like news and more like recognition. Wren read every letter. She answered none of them yet, but she kept them in a folder on her kitchen table, and some nights after the children were asleep, she sat and reread them, and the weight of all those voices, all those women sitting in their own versions of the Flats apartment with their own versions of $500, made the thing she was doing feel larger than a mineral rights claim. It made it feel like something that had been waiting to happen for a long time, the way Elias's truth had been waiting in the bunker. Not just her truth, a truth that belonged to every person who had ever been told that what they had built did not belong to them. The hearing lasted 2 days. The courtroom was a state facility in Sheridan chosen for its neutrality, a clean modern space with good lighting and acoustic panels, and the institutional calm of a room designed for the careful resolution of disputes between parties who could not resolve them elsewhere. It was filled to capacity both days. Reporters occupied the back rows. The coalition's legal team filled one side of the gallery with the practiced ease of attorneys who were accustomed to occupying large amounts of space in courtrooms and who viewed the occupation itself as a form of argument. Cope presented his case with the particular precision of a man who understood that he was outmanned and outspent, and that his only advantage was that he was right, and that being right in a courtroom presided over by a judge who had no reason to be anything other than impartial was the only advantage he needed. He presented Elias Whitfield's original state filing. He presented the unaltered survey documentation. He presented the chain of title from Elias's estate through the county condemnation to the auction to Wren. He presented the deed transfer properly executed and recorded. He called a geological expert from the University of Wyoming who confirmed using independent modern survey data that Elias's 1947 assessment of the formation was accurate, that the subsurface mineral reserves were as significant as Elias had documented, and that the mineral rights in question were demonstrably tied to the original claim. Then Cope called Dorothea Whitfield. Dorothea walked to the witness stand with the careful, straight-backed dignity of a woman who had spent 78 years carrying something she had not understood the weight of until 2 weeks ago. She wore a dark dress and no jewelry, and she carried a tin box that she set on the ledge of the witness stand in front of her as if it were something sacred. She told the court about her grandfather. She told them about the family dinners where his name was spoken with pity. She told them about the word that had been used to describe him for 50 years, the word that had shaped her understanding of who he was and what he had done and what the bunker on Holloway Ridge meant. Troubled, paranoid. A man who had lost touch with reality. A man whose obsession with a legal case he had lost decades ago had become the defining feature of his life, the thing the family organized itself around the way families organize themselves around illness. Then she opened the tin box, she took out the letters, and she read in a voice that did not waver passages from Elias Whitfield's own hand written to his daughter Ruth between 1955 and 1967, describing what he had built and what he had sealed inside it and why. She read his words about the formation. She read his words about the consortium. She read his words about the legal system that had failed him and the filing he had made in Cheyenne as a final act of defiance against a failure he refused to accept as permanent. And she read the last letter dated March of 1967, 1 year before Elias died, in which he wrote to his daughter, "They will tell you I was broken. They will say the bunker is proof that I lost my mind. But Ruth, I need you to understand something. I built that room because I was the sanest person in every courtroom I stood in. I built it because the truth does not stop being true when powerful people decide it is inconvenient. I sealed that door because I knew that one day someone would open it. I do not know who. I do not know when. But I know they will need what is inside, and I know it will be there because I built it to last." The courtroom was silent, not the procedural silence of a room waiting for the next motion or the next witness. The silence of people hearing something that has rearranged their understanding of what they thought they knew. Judge Renfield looked at Dorothea for a long moment after she finished, and then she looked down at her notes, and then she called a recess. The coalition's legal team presented their counter-arguments when the hearing resumed. They presented them with considerable force and considerable expense, and they presented one argument in particular that landed in the courtroom like a crack appearing in a wall. The 1951 state filing, they argued, was missing a page. Specifically, it was missing the certification page, the page that bore the official state seal, and the registrar's signature confirming that the filing had been received and recorded as a completed instrument. Without that page, the filing was procedurally incomplete. An incomplete filing was unenforceable. And an unenforceable filing meant that Elias Whitfield's mineral rights claim, no matter how well documented, no matter how accurate his survey data, no matter how moving his granddaughter's testimony, had never been legally perfected. The argument was technical, it was precise, and it was potentially devastating. Cope sat very still when it was delivered. Wren, sitting behind him in the gallery, watched the color shift in his face. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone unfamiliar with him would have noticed, but in the way that told her with the particular attention she had developed over the past months for reading the people who were fighting on her behalf that he had not expected this. He had verified the filing with the state office in Cheyenne. He had confirmed that it was on record. But he had not physically examined the original document at the State Archive, and the coalition's attorneys had. And what they had found, or rather what they had not found, was the single page that held the entire structure together. Judge Renfield looked at Cope. "Counselor," she said, "can you produce the certification page?" Cope stood. "Your Honor, I request a 24-hour continuance to locate the document." Renfield studied him. She was a careful judge, deliberate in her decisions, and she understood that what was being asked of her was significant. A continuance in a case of this magnitude at this stage of the proceedings was not a routine request. It was an admission that the plaintiff's case had a gap that needed to be filled, and gaps in cases of this magnitude tended to become permanent if they were not filled quickly. 24 hours, she said. Court reconvenes at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Wren left the courthouse and drove directly to Holloway Ridge. It was late afternoon, and the light was already failing. The November sun dropping behind the mountains to the west and pulling the color out of the landscape the way it always did, leaving everything in shades of gray and brown and the particular blue-black of Wyoming twilight. She drove the Subaru up the old track, parked, and walked the rest of the way to the bunker in near darkness. She unlocked the door, she went inside. She turned on the work light she had installed during the renovation and stood in the main room looking at the 14 cases on the shelves along the far wall. 14 cases sealed and stacked with Elias Whitfield's meticulous precision. She had opened most of them during the weeks of preparation with Cope. Survey equipment, core samples, technical documentation, correspondence. Each one labeled and organized and containing exactly what the folio said it contained. But case number 7 she had not fully examined. She had opened it, noted its contents, a collection of sealed envelopes and supplementary documents, and moved on because the primary evidence she needed had been in the other cases and the folio itself, and there had not been time to examine every envelope in every case with the thoroughness that Elias would have approved of. She pulled case 7 from the shelf. It was heavy, the same military-grade metal as the others, with a clasp mechanism that still functioned smoothly after 7 decades. She opened it on the wooden table and looked at the contents. Envelopes, 8 of them. 7 she had already opened during the preparation phase. 1 she had not. The 8th envelope was sealed with wax, not the brittle decorative wax of a letter from a stationery shop. A thick, dark, deliberately applied wax seal that had been pressed with something flat and smooth, creating an airtight closure that had held for 72 years. Wren had noticed it during her initial inventory and had left it unopened because the wax was intact, and she had been reluctant to break a seal that Elias had clearly intended to be broken only when it was needed. She understood now, standing in the bunker at 7 o'clock on a November evening, with 24 hours between her case and its collapse, that this was when it was needed. She broke the seal. The wax cracked, cleanly falling away in 2 pieces onto the table surface. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper, the certification page, the original, bearing the official seal of the state of Wyoming dated March 14, 1951, with the registrar's signature and Elias Whitfield's signature below it, both clear and legible and authenticated by the state's own stamp. Elias had anticipated this. He had known, with the foresight of a man who had spent 4 years watching courts fail him and institutions betray him, that the state filing would be vulnerable, that someone someday would attempt to challenge its completeness, that the certification page, the single document that confirmed the filing, had been properly received and perfected, was the most important page in the entire case, and therefore the page most likely to disappear from an archive that was not immune to the influence of people with sufficient motivation to ensure its disappearance. So he had kept the original. He had sealed it in wax and placed it in a metal case in a concrete room inside a hill, and trusted that when the moment came when the filing was challenged and the page was needed, whoever had found his bunker would be thorough enough to find it. Wren held the page in both hands. Her fingers were steady. She was not shaking, She was not crying. She was standing in a room built by a man who had been called paranoid by his own family and delusional by the courts that had failed him, and she was holding proof that he had been the most sane person in every room he had ever entered. She drove home. She did not sleep. At 8:30 the next morning, she walked into the courthouse in Sheridan and handed the certification page to Russell Cope, who looked at it, looked at her, and said nothing for a moment that lasted longer than any moment in their professional relationship had lasted before. Then he stood up, straightened his tie, and walked into the courtroom. He presented the page without drama. He placed it on the evidence table and identified it for the record, and let Judge Renfield examine it with the careful attention she applied to everything. The seal was genuine. The signatures were genuine. The date matched the filing. The certification was complete. Then Cope called Dorothea Whitfield back to the stand. Dorothea, who had sat in the gallery through the previous afternoon's proceedings with her hands folded in her lap and her face held in an expression of such concentrated stillness that people near her had been uncertain whether she was breathing, returned to the witness stand, and in response to a single question from Cope about whether her grandfather had ever spoken about protecting his records from interference, she said quietly, "He told my mother that they would try to erase him. He said it in the letter dated November 1962. He wrote, 'They will go to the archives. They will try to remove the page that proves the filing was completed. But I have kept the original, and it is in the room, and it will be there when it is needed.'" The courtroom was silent again. The coalition's lead attorney did not cross-examine. Judge Renfield took the matter under advisement and asked both parties to consider whether a negotiated resolution might be preferable to a protracted trial. The language was judicial. The meaning was clear. She had seen enough. The negotiation took 3 weeks. The coalition opened at $3 million. Cope declined without consulting Wren because they had already discussed the floor and $3 million was beneath it. The coalition came back at $7 million. Cope declined again. There was a pause of 4 days during which nothing happened, and everything felt like it was happening the particular tension of a negotiation in which both sides understand the eventual outcome, but neither is ready to arrive at it yet. Wren slept badly during those 4 days. She ate little. She sat at the kitchen table in the Flats apartment and stared at the wall and felt the weight of the thing she was carrying. The weight of Elias's trust and Dorothea's testimony and Cope's precision and her own refusal to accept less than what the truth was worth. She felt for the first time since the bunker door had opened the full gravitational pull of the possibility that she might be wrong. Not wrong about the claim, not wrong about the documents or the formation or the mineral rights, wrong about herself, wrong about her ability to stand in this particular wind and not be moved by it. On the third night, Margot came into the kitchen at 11 o'clock. She was in her pajamas and her hair was down, and she looked in the dim light of the second-hand lamp, both impossibly young and impossibly old, the way 17-year-old girls look when they have been carrying adult weight on frames that were not designed for it. She sat down across from her mother and said nothing for a while. Then she said, "You taught me something, Mom. You probably do not remember teaching it because you did not say it out loud. You showed it, over and over, every day since the divorce and probably before." Wren looked at her daughter. "You taught me that people cannot take what belongs to you if you know it belongs to you. If you really know, not hope, not wish, know." Wren reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "I know," Wren said. "I know what belongs to us." On the fourth day, the coalition's lead attorney called Cope and presented a final offer, $12 million, a full release of all claims against the mineral rights formation by all parties, and a separate agreement in which Meridian Energy would pay an ongoing annual royalty to Wren's estate for continued extraction operations at a rate negotiated independently of the settlement figure. The royalty, Cope told Wren when he called, would amount to approximately $300,000 per year at current extraction volumes. Wren sat on the edge of her bed in the Flats apartment with the phone against her ear and listened to Cope read the terms in his precise, careful voice. The same voice that had read Elias's documents on the first day in his Sheridan office. The same voice that had presented the case in Judge Renfield's courtroom. The voice of a man who had spent his career waiting for a case that mattered this much, and who had conducted himself throughout with the quiet, unshakable dignity of someone who understood that the law, when properly applied, was still capable of producing justice. Counter, Wren said when he finished. 14 million. Same royalty structure, and I keep the 3-acre property and the bunker. Everything inside it stays with me. Cope was quiet for a moment. The bunker has no material value to them, he said. They will agree to that. It has value to me, Wren said. Cope relayed the counter. The consortium responded within an hour, agreed. The settlement was signed 11 days later in Cope's Sheridan office. The wire transfer arrived the following morning. Wren sat at the small kitchen table in the Flats apartment with her laptop open and watched the number appear in her account with the quality of something seen through water, something real and present, and yet somehow not fully solid, as if the screen might change its mind and take the number back. She did not move for several minutes. Then Margot came into the kitchen in her school uniform, poured herself a glass of water, and looked at her mother with the careful attention she had developed over the past year for reading situations before they were explained to her. The attention of a girl who had packed her room into garbage bags and worn the same 3 outfits to school for 2 months, and never once asked for anything, because asking would have meant acknowledging a need that might not be met. And Margot had decided early that she would rather go without than watch her mother fail to provide. "Mom," she said quietly, "did something happen?" Wren closed the laptop. She looked at her daughter, this composed, brave, impossibly steady girl who had been carrying weight that no 17-year-old should carry, and who had done it without complaint and without breaking and without ever letting her mother see the cost. "Yes," Wren said. She reached across the table and took Margot's hand. "Something happened. Go wake up your brother." She told them at the kitchen table while the Wyoming morning came pale and cold through the window. She told them about the settlement. She told them about the royalty. She told them about the number in the account. She told them that the bunker and the 3 acres were theirs permanently. Lachlan sat very still through most of it, his hands flat on the table surface, his eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance that only he could see. Then he put his face in his hands and breathed slowly, for a while the way people breathe when they are trying to hold something too large for the space it is occupying. And Wren let him breathe because she understood that what was happening inside him was not something that could be rushed or narrated or helped along by words. It had to move at its own speed. Margot held her mother's hand and did not let go until the end. "We are going to be okay," Wren said. "I need you both to really hear that. We are going to be okay." Wren Calloway did not move to a bigger house right away. This surprised people, and she understood why. The narrative logic of the thing seemed to demand it. The woman who had been living in the Flats apartment with 2 children and a cracked rear bumper on her Subaru should, upon receiving $14 million and an annual royalty of $300,000, immediately relocate to something that looked like the life she had lost. A house in the Millbrook subdivision, perhaps. Something with a proper driveway and granite countertops and enough space to make the previous year feel like something that had happened to someone else. But Wren had spent 18 years living inside someone else's version of what her life should look like, and she had learned at considerable cost to be careful about that particular impulse. The impulse to let the shape of your life be determined by what other people expected it to contain. So she stayed in the Flats apartment through the winter. She paid Clive 3 months' rent in advance, and when she handed him the check, Clive stood in the doorway of his own apartment with the check in his hand and his reading glasses sliding down his nose, and he was quiet for a long time before he said in a voice that was rougher than he intended, "Thank you, Wren." It was the first time he had used her first name, and She spent the first 60 days after the settlement doing almost nothing except thinking clearly. This was a luxury she had not been able to afford in years. The luxury of sitting in a quiet room with no crisis demanding immediate action and allowing her mind to move at its own pace through the landscape of what had happened and what might happen next. She had spent so long in reactive mode, responding to emergencies, adapting to losses, adjusting to reductions, that the experience of simply sitting and thinking and not being chased by anything was almost disorienting. The first decision she made was about Russell Cope. She paid his contingency fee in full, which was contractually required and which he had earned many times over. Then she wrote him a separate check that was not contractually required, a check that represented what Wren believed his work was actually worth when measured not just in legal hours and filing fees, but in the particular currency of a man who had believed in a case that no one else would have touched, who had walked into a courtroom outmanned and outspent and outgunned, and who had won not because he was louder, but because he was right, and because he had the discipline and the patience and the quiet, unshakable conviction to let being right be enough. Cope sat in his office chair for a long moment when she handed it to him. He did not say thank you. He said, "You were the right client for this case, Wren. I want you to know that. Not every client would have held." The second decision was about the bunker. She hired a structural engineer from Casper to assess the property on Holloway Ridge Road, and the assessment confirmed what Lachlan had said on the first day. It was solid, it was sound. It had been built to last by a man who understood that the value of what he was protecting required a structure that would outlast every force that might be applied against it. The concrete was as strong as the day Elias Whitfield had poured it. She hired a small renovation crew, people she chose carefully, people who understood that their job was not to modernize the structure, but to preserve it. They cleaned the interior. They stabilized the ventilation system. They installed proper lighting and a reliable heating unit. They restored the steel door to full working order, replacing the corroded hinges with new ones that move smoothly and quietly, the way a door should move when it is being opened regularly by people who have business inside. They left the concrete walls bare. They left the wooden table in the center of the main room exactly where Elias had placed it. They left the metal shelving intact, and they built a proper road from the highway to the property, graded and graveled and lined on both sides with young juniper trees that Wren selected herself, trees that would take years to grow properly and would be beautiful when they did, the way things are beautiful when they are given the time they need to become what they are meant to be. When the renovation was complete, Wren established the Whitfield Foundation, headquartered in the bunker on the 3-acre property that was now officially and permanently hers. The foundation's purpose was specific and practical, the way everything Wren built was specific and practical. Emergency financial assistance, legal aid, and job retraining for women in Crestfall County and beyond who were rebuilding after divorce or financial crisis. It offered the things Wren had needed and had not been able to find when she needed them. A real attorney when the legal aid office was overwhelmed. A bridge payment when the gap between losing everything and earning something new was too wide to cross alone. And a pathway back into the workforce for women whose resumes had gaps that looked like failures but were actually evidence that they had spent years doing the hardest and least compensated work. There is the work of keeping families and households and other people's ambitions alive. In the first year, the Whitfield Foundation helped 31 women. By the end of the second year, the number had grown to 86. Applications came from across Wyoming and then from beyond. Wren hired a small staff. She brought in Cope as a legal advisor. She partnered with the University of Wyoming on a professional re-entry program that offered accelerated certification courses at no cost to foundation recipients, because Wren understood that a lapsed credential was not evidence of inability, but evidence of sacrifice, and that the path back should not be made harder than the path that had led away. Nolan Garvey wrote the story he had promised to write. It was the longest piece of his career. It ran in the Crestfall Courier across 3 issues, and it told the full story of Wren and Elias and Dorothea and the bunker and the formation and the case, and it told it with the careful, honest attention of a journalist who had learned something about the difference between a story that is easy to write and a story that is true. It was the most widely shared article in the history of the Crestfall Courier, and when it was picked up by wire services and reprinted in newspapers across the state, Garvey called Wren and asked if she needed help managing the foundation's growing public profile. She hired him as a pro bono communications advisor, which was not a form of forgiveness exactly, but was something adjacent to it, something that acknowledged that people are capable of doing better when they are given the opportunity and the expectation. She eventually bought a house, not in Millbrook. She bought a modest place on the western edge of Crestfall with a wide front porch and enough land for a kitchen garden and a view of the foothills that changed color with the seasons in a way that never became ordinary, no matter how many times she saw it. It was close enough to the community she had decided to stay part of, far enough from the version of that community that had laughed at her in the county administration building on a Thursday morning in November. Margot went to law school at the University of Colorado. She called her mother every Sunday without fail and talked about the cases that moved her, the ones involving women who had been outmaneuvered by better funded legal teams, the ones where the outcome had turned on something as simple as knowing what to file and where and when. She was going to be a very good lawyer. She was going to be the kind of lawyer that Patricia Sims had tried to be, but had not had the resources to become. And Wren understood that this was not a coincidence, but a continuation, the next link in a chain that had begun with a man in Cheyenne who refused to let the truth be taken from him. Lachlan studied structural engineering. On the day he was accepted into his program, he called his mother and told her that the first thing he had ever wanted to build properly was the road to the bunker. He said he wanted to build things that lasted the way Elias Whitfield had built things that lasted. The way a concrete room inside a hill had held its shape and its purpose and its contents intact through 72 years of silence and weather and the slow, patient pressure of a world that had forgotten it was there. Wren kept the iron key on a hook by her front door. She kept Elias Whitfield's folio in a climate-controlled case in the main room of the bunker, visible to everyone who visited the foundation. Beside it, framed simply in dark wood, was a single sentence she had taken from the last page of his journal. The final thing he had written before he sealed the door and walked away from a room he would never enter again into an outcome he would never see. I do not know who you are, but I know you were not supposed to find this, and I know that means you needed it. Dorothea Whitfield visited the bunker on a Saturday in April, 7 months after the settlement. Wren drove her from Casper herself. They did not speak much during the drive. Dorothea sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap and looked out the window at the Wyoming landscape, passing by the grassland and the sage and the distant mountains, and her expression had the quality of someone returning to a place they have never been but have been thinking about for a very long time. When they arrived, Wren unlocked the steel door and held it open while Dorothea walked inside. The old woman moved slowly down the corridor, one hand trailing along the concrete wall, the same gesture Lachlan had made on the first day, the instinct to touch what you cannot yet believe. She entered the main room and stood in front of the wooden table, the table where her grandfather had sat and written his testament by lamplight. And she placed her hand flat on the surface, the way you place your hand on the headstone of someone you loved, and she stood there for a long time without speaking. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and clear and carried the weight of 50 years of something being set down at last. He was right, she said. He was always right. Wren stood beside her in the concrete room that smelled of time and preservation, and the particular air of a place that had been built to hold things safely until they were needed, and she said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Some truths do not require commentary. They require only a witness. In the 3 years following the settlement, Wren was asked many times to explain the decision. Reporters asked it. The journalist from Denver asked it during a follow-up interview. Women who came to the Whitfield Foundation asked it while sitting across from her in the main room of the bunker, in the same space where Elias had once sat and written his final pages. They all wanted to know the same thing in slightly different words. How did you know? What made you raise your hand? What made you spend your last $500 on something everyone said was worthless? And Wren always gave them the same honest answer because it was the only one she had. She had not known. There was no wisdom in it, no foresight, no quiet certainty that she was making the right move. There had been nothing in that auction room except a woman who had run out of every other option and a property that nobody else wanted. And 4 days before she lost the only roof her children had, she had raised her hand because she had nothing left to protect by keeping it down. That was the full extent of it. But here's what she came to understand in the years after, and this is the part that matters. The part she made sure to say clearly to every woman who sat across from her in that concrete room and looked at her with the particular expression of someone trying to find the formula, the secret, the mechanism that would make their own desperate situation resolve the way Wren's had. The decision was not the miracle. The miracle was that she had not talked herself out of it. Because there had been a version of that morning where she drove past the community board and did not stop. A version where she sat in the auction room and watched the numbers climb beyond her reach and left before the last property was called. A version where she heard the laughter and let it settle over her like a verdict. A version where she looked at the rusted door and concluded that the people mocking her were right, that she was desperate and foolish, and that the reasonable thing was to accept defeat with whatever grace she could manage and find something more realistic to do with her last 4 days. All of those versions existed. She had felt every one of them pulling at her while it was happening. The voice that said you are being ridiculous was not quiet. The voice that cataloged every way this could go wrong was not vague. The voice that reminded her of the laughter in the auction room, of Garrett's smugness, of every person in Crestfall who had watched her life come apart and found it clarifying rather than troubling. That voice was loud and specific, and it knew exactly which parts of her were still soft enough to reach. She raised her hand anyway, not because she was brave in any exceptional sense, not because she had a plan or a vision or a premonition, but because the alternative, the quiet, reasonable dignity, preserving alternative of doing nothing, had a cost she had finally calculated clearly enough to reject. Doing nothing cost her children everything. Raising her hand cost $500 and the goodwill of people whose goodwill had never actually protected her from anything. When she laid it out in those terms, the math was not complicated. If you have ever sat with something small in your hands and wondered whether it was enough to begin with, Wren Calloway's answer is yes. It is always enough to begin with. The only thing that was never enough was giving up. Dreams do not age, hope does not expire, and justice, even sealed in concrete for 72 years, eventually finds its way into the hands of someone willing to open the door. If this story moved you, leave one word in the comments that describes what you would do if you were standing in that auction room with your last $500 and nothing left to lose. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, not because it promises that every desperate decision leads to $14 million and a foundation and a road lined with young junipers growing slowly towards something beautiful. It does not make that promise, and neither does life, but because it is true, because it happened, because a woman with $500 and 2 children and 4 days left on her apartment raised her hand in a room full of people laughing at her, and the thing nobody wanted turned out to be the thing that changed everything. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss what comes next. We have saved something special for you tomorrow. Up on your screen right now are 2 more stories that hit just as hard. Click one and see for yourself.